Thank you very much. And it's hard to say I'm happy to be here. I think it's important to be adding my voice and our voice to this conversation. But I think it would be paradoxical to be happy to be having this conversation because it is absurdly ridiculous that we have to, in 2021, be having a conversation about whether or not New York State ought to be profiting off of forced labor. I want to build a bridge between what Egypt said and what Mark said. Um, Egypt talked about the 13th Amendment, and indeed, as was listed in the chat, the 13th Amendment we celebrate oftentimes for abolishing slavery, but often forget or are misled to recognize that there is an exemption to this abolition of slavery. And that exemption is when you are convicted of a felony. And they say duly convicted of a felony, which is just legal terms to say that you had a jury of your peers who said you were convicted of a crime. And so immediately after the end of enslavement, at the end of the process with which people fought for abolition, we find a scenario where there was a creation of a number of laws to ensure that we would reinstitute formerly enslaved people. And I think it's important for us to use enslaved as opposed to slaves, because no one is born a slave. People are enslaved. They were forced into that station. And so formerly enslaved people were brought back in a context of policing Black bodies to develop criminality based off of your Blackness. And over 120 plus years later, we find in New York State a scenario where there's a surmountable number of largely Black and brown and oftentimes downstate individuals who are fed into the prison system to fulfill the economic development opportunities or challenges in rural communities. That is not just one part of the problem. Corecraft and indeed the 13th Amendment exemption in New York State's Constitution is another problem that ought to be addressed, because fundamentally what we are finding is a scenario whereby New York State is making $50 million in revenue just off of Corecraft alone. And I want to be clear, New York State is profiting off of forced labor in 2021. And as it relates to what Mark, and I don't know if people know the folks at RAPP, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the work that RAPP has been doing and for the leaders and organizers who have been pushing this movement for fair and timely parole, for elder parole and fair and timely, two bills that are in the current state legislature that haven't been voted on as of yet. It's important for us to understand that in a moment where we had a global pandemic, where prison population, and as we knew, elderly people were particularly prone to being having negative likely outcomes if they were to contract COVID-19. They were denied the ability for having release, which they should have been. They have been denied until litigation the ability to get vaccines. And the irony is that in order for us to address supply chain issues in the United States, especially in New York State, with respect to hand sanitizer, where there was a shortage because of the significant demand and not enough supply for hand sanitizers, Governor Cuomo went on national television and said New York State has hand sanitizers, but was remiss to say, and by the way, those hand sanitizers were made by people who were forced to make it, who themselves could not benefit from the hand sanitizer. And so there is a direct line and relationship between the need for CUNY, which is what we're here to do, to cut ties and relationships to forced labor, very much akin to what we talk about when we talk about slave labor from the coffee industry or child labor from the textile industry. New York State is no different than those areas of the developing world where we find those scenarios happening. And we have justified it by stating that, well, they were convicted of a felony, irrespective to the fact that we know that Black and brown communities are over-policed, that Black and brown communities are more likely to have an access to bail and not have adequate counsel and have prosecutors overzealous, and the realities of the criminal legal system. It is essential for us to understand that it is about time that New York State withdraw its exemption to the 13th Amendment and pass legislation and create a constitutional amendment so that no one else in New York State is forced to engage in labor so that the state can benefit and profit off of legalized enslavement. And it's essential that young people, that students of CUNY, City University of New York, make it clear that we will not accept a reality whereby our furniture and our equipment and supplies from forced labor will be accepted in our school system. And last but certainly not least, it is terribly important to understand the relationship between how our carceral state is so prolific in every sphere of our lives, such that there is a tremendous incentive to continue to funnel people into the carceral state to balance the budget of our New York State budget. And that should never be acceptable. I want to end by paradoxically, again, thanking you all for having an opportunity, reminding you that as Egypt mentioned, and as Mark mentioned, a furniture line, I want to uplift one particular furniture line called the Attica Collection, which sounds like an amazing piece of furniture, sounds like an amazing brand, except when you recognize that the Attica Collection is a furniture line built by imprisoned people in Attica prison. And when we understand that our schools, that our universities, and that many spheres of our state government buildings and offices are paying for furniture and supplies and goods brought from enslaved labor, we have to begin to question whether or not in 2021, New York State ought to be the state that enables that. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm a member of the 13th Forward campaign. Please, please, please come join our work. This is important work. And I hope that RAPP is able to get these two pieces of legislation through. Thank you for listening today.